I have never really talked about this night before, mostly because every time I think about it, I get the same tight feeling in my chest, like my body is reminding me that something was wrong long before my mind caught up. It was 2020, right in the middle of all the chaos after the pandemic had wrecked my retail job, and I had started driving late nights for a rideshare app just to survive. I preferred nights because the roads were empty and the silence usually felt calming. But that Friday in early October changed the way I look at quiet forever. Just after midnight, I dropped someone off at a hotel near the edge of town and almost immediately got another request. The pickup was about 6 minutes away, outside a bowling alley in a strip mall that looked completely shut down. When I pulled into the parking lot, the place was dead quiet, lit only by a few dim yellow lights. That's when I saw him, standing alone under one of the lights, tall, wearing a gray hoodie and dark jeans, hands in his pockets, head tilted down like he was staring at the ground. I rolled down my window and asked if he was my pickup, and he nodded without saying a word before getting into the back seat directly behind me. From the moment he sat down, something felt off. His voice was flat when he confirmed the destination, an address about 20 minutes away in a residential area I didn't recognize, and then he went completely silent. Every few minutes, I glanced in the rearview mirror, and every single time, he was staring straight ahead, not at his phone, not out the window, just fixed on the back of my head. I tried to make small talk, asking how his night was going, and after a long pause, he said, "I just needed to get out of there." When I asked where there was, he replied, "Doesn't matter," and the silence closed in again. As we got closer to the destination, the neighborhood grew darker and more isolated, with large yards, no streetlights, and trees pressing in from both sides of the road. When the GPS told me we were almost there, he suddenly leaned forward and pointed to a dark house on the right, telling me to pull into the driveway. The house looked abandoned, with peeling paint, overgrown grass, and no lights on anywhere, and there wasn't a single car in sight. I asked if that was his place, and he just said, "Pull in and wait." Against my better judgment, I did. He got out of the car and walked around the side of the house instead of going to the front door, disappearing from view completely. I sat there for a couple of minutes, my hands gripping the steering wheel, my instincts screaming that something wasn't right. And finally, I ended the trip and started to back out. Before I could even shift into reverse, I saw him coming back fast, almost rushing toward the car, his face tense in a way I couldn't read. He got back into the car and told me to take him somewhere else. When I said he'd need to put it in the app, he didn't respond. He just stared at me in the mirror until the pressure felt unbearable, then told me to drive back to where I picked him up. The ride back felt longer than the entire night, the car filled with a heavy, suffocating silence, and when I tried to lighten the mood by saying it sounded like a rough night, he replied quietly, "Not yet." When we arrived back at the strip mall, he leaned forward and asked, "Do you ever wonder how you're going to die?" I laughed nervously and said it wasn't something I thought about, but he didn't laugh at all, just said, "I think about it all the time." He stepped out of the car, paused with the door half open, looked straight at me, and said, "You picked the wrong guy up tonight," before shutting the door and walking off into the darkness behind the bowling alley. I sat there for a long time before driving home, checking my mirrors the entire way. When I finally got inside, I opened the trip history to report what happened, but the ride wasn't there anymore. No name, No photo, no record, like it had never existed. Support told me the data was unavailable and blamed a system issue. But I know what I experienced. I know that man was in my car, and I know what he said. Ever since then, whenever I pull into a dark parking lot or hear the quiet breathing of a passenger sitting directly behind me, I think about that night and wonder what he meant, what he was planning, and whether he simply changed his mind at the last second, or if he was still out there waiting for the right car. I have never told this story publicly, because even now, years later, thinking about it still makes my stomach tighten in a way I can't quite explain. It happened in 2021, when I was driving full-time overnight for a ride-share service, working mostly after midnight because the money was better and the roads were quieter. Around 1:30 in the morning, I accepted a request from a pickup point that already felt a little off, a side street behind an old strip mall that had been mostly abandoned for years. I assumed the location pin was just inaccurate, which happens more often than people realize. And when I arrived, I saw a man standing alone near the corner, wearing a hoodie and jeans, staring down at his phone. I called out his name. He nodded and climbed into the back seat without a greeting. He didn't smell like alcohol, didn't slur his words, and didn't seem angry, just extremely quiet, like he was conserving energy or lost in his own head. Once we started driving, I noticed the destination was about 25 minutes away in a suburban neighborhood I rarely visited. One of those places where the houses are far apart and the streets feel empty even during the day. About 5 minutes into the ride, I saw something strange in the mirror. He had his phone resting flat on his lap with the flashlight turned on, the beam pointed upward toward the back of my seat. Not bright enough to blind me, but noticeable enough to make my skin crawl. I asked if everything was okay back there, trying to keep my tone light, and he muttered, "Yeah," before turning the light off. After that, the car was completely silent. The kind of silence that feels heavy rather than peaceful. When we finally reached the neighborhood, there were no street lights, just the faint glow of the moon and the headlights cutting through the darkness. The GPS led me to a house that was completely dark. No porch light, no interior lights, nothing that suggested anyone was awake or even home. I asked if this was the right place, and he didn't respond. I repeated myself, louder this time, and he slowly nodded without looking at me. I put the car in park and told him to have a good night, but he didn't move. He just sat there, staring out the window. When I asked if he was all set, he finally opened the door and stepped out. But instead of closing it, he stood there facing the house, breathing heavily, the door still wide open. I waited, unsure what to do, and after nearly a full minute, he suddenly turned back toward me and said he needed to go back to where I picked him up. I told him he would need to request a new ride, and that's when he said something I still hear clearly in my head. "I can't. They're not gone yet." I asked who he meant, but he didn't answer. Just kept standing there, his breathing uneven. Every instinct I had was telling me to leave. So when he finally closed the door and walked toward the house, I pulled away immediately and ended the trip as soon as I turned the corner. A few blocks later, I stopped at a 24-hour gas station to use the bathroom and calm myself down. I was inside for no more than 4 minutes. When I came back out and opened my car door, my mind went completely blank. He was sitting in the back seat again, in the exact same spot, wearing the same hoodie, looking exactly the same as before. I was certain I had locked the doors, but there he was. I asked him how he got back in, and all he said was, "Take me back." I reached for my phone, telling him I was calling the police, and he leaned forward just enough for me to hear his breathing and said, "They're still in the house." Something about the way he said it stopped me. I didn't know if he was dangerous or deeply unwell, but I was afraid of what might happen if I escalated the situation. I asked whose house it was, and after a pause, he said, "My parents." When I asked if he lived there, he replied, "Not anymore." I drove him back, my hands shaking on the steering wheel, while he rocked slightly in the seat and whispered that they wouldn't leave no matter what he did. When we arrived, the house was still completely dark, exactly as before. He got out, walked up to the front door, and just stood there, perfectly still, not knocking, not moving, like he was frozen in place. I didn't wait to see anything else. I drove away, parked under a streetlight several blocks away, and sat there for 10 minutes trying to slow my breathing. I never slept that night. The next day, I reported the ride to the company, but I didn't contact the police, and that decision still bothers me. I don't know if he was having a mental health crisis, if there really were people in that house, or if something much worse could have happened if I had stayed longer. All I know is that sometimes the most frightening encounters don't end with screams or violence, but with unanswered questions that stay with you long after the night is over. I was 18 years old when this happened, living alone in a small apartment on the edge of town with only my dog for company. And at the time, I didn't think there was anything unusual or dangerous about ordering food to be left at my door. It was a Friday evening, and I had spent hours cleaning because my boyfriend was supposed to visit the next day. So by the time it was past 6, I was exhausted and hungry and didn't want to dirty the kitchen again. I placed an order through a food delivery app and set the instructions to contactless delivery, something I always did because I was young, lived alone, and felt safer that way. I was sitting on my couch watching TV when my phone buzzed, telling me the food had been delivered. I got up immediately, opened my door, and froze when I saw there was nothing there. I checked the neighboring doors, thinking maybe it had been left at the wrong apartment, but the hallway was empty. I had just stepped back inside to message the driver when there was a knock. It was my next-door neighbor, holding my food bag. He told me he was sorry for grabbing it without asking, but he had seen the delivery driver standing outside my door, looking through my windows, and it didn't sit right with him. So he picked up the food before the driver could do anything else. I thanked him, shut the door, and tried to convince myself it was just a misunderstanding. Maybe the driver was confused or waiting for instructions. I ate, watched a movie, and eventually got ready for bed. Later that night, I woke up to my dog growling, low and steady, the kind of sound that instantly puts you on edge. He's tiny, barely 5 pounds, but the sound coming from him made my heart race. I calmed him down and went back to sleep, only to be jolted awake again, less than 15 minutes later, by loud banging on my bedroom window. My dog went into full panic, barking, growling, whining, and I couldn't move. I pulled the covers over myself, leaving just enough space to see, and called the police in a whisper, telling the operator that someone was outside my window and that it didn't lock properly. She told me to get to another room and that officers were on the way. I grabbed a knife from the kitchen and stood there shaking, watching for lights or hearing sirens. When I finally looked out the kitchen window, my stomach dropped. Parked across the street, near the open field beside my building, was the same car listed in the app as my delivery driver's vehicle. The car was empty, and in that moment, it clicked that whoever had been driving it was not inside. He was somewhere near my apartment. When the police arrived, I could barely speak. One officer stayed with me while the others searched the backyard area near my bedroom window. Because it had rained earlier, the ground was muddy, and they found clear footprints leading along the back of my apartment. They also checked the car, but the driver was nowhere to be found. My neighbor came out and explained how he had taken my food earlier, and I could tell from the officers' faces that this was more serious than I wanted to believe. After they left, I thought it was over, but around 2 in the morning, there was another knock, this time at my front door, and my heart nearly stopped. It was the same officer from earlier. She told me they had stayed nearby, watching the area, and that the man had come back, walking straight toward my front door, as if he was trying to figure out a way inside. They arrested him before he could do anything else. I thanked her and closed the door, but I didn't sleep at all that night. Even now, years later, I still think about how close he was, how easily things could have gone differently, and how something as ordinary as ordering dinner turned into the most terrifying night of my life. I never use food delivery services when I'm home alone anymore, and I still wonder how long he would have waited outside if my neighbor hadn't trusted his instincts. I was 26 when this happened, visiting Washington, D.C. to see my fiancée, who I'll call Sarah. She had just finished basic training, and her graduation was coming up, so I flew in a week early so we could spend some quiet time together before her family arrived. One afternoon, after hours of walking around the city, seeing monuments and historic buildings, we were exhausted and ready to head back to the hotel. Sarah ordered a ride on her phone while I sat down nearby, barely paying attention, my legs sore and my mind already drifting toward the idea of a long nap. About 10 minutes later, a gray minivan pulled over near us, not at a proper pickup spot, but close enough that we assumed it was ours. Sarah opened the door and asked, "Uber for Sarah?" The driver gave a small nod and nothing else. That should have been the moment we stopped and double-checked everything, but we didn't. We both got in and shut the door. From the start, something felt wrong. The driver didn't greet us, didn't confirm our destination, didn't say a single word. He just pulled away from the curb and started driving. I tried to ignore it, telling myself he was just quiet. But after a few minutes, Sarah tapped my arm and showed me her phone. The route on the screen didn't match where we were going. We were heading in the opposite direction. Almost at the same time, a notification popped up saying our ride had arrived, followed by a message from the actual driver asking where we were. That was when the reality of the situation hit me all at once. We were in the wrong car. I slowly looked toward the driver, my heart pounding, and tried to keep my voice calm as I told him we'd changed our minds and needed to get out. He glanced at me in the rearview mirror for the first time, his eyes unreadable, and then looked back at the road without saying anything or slowing down. The silence inside the car felt suffocating. I realized then that whatever his intentions were, they weren't good. And I knew we couldn't let him take us any farther away from where we'd been picked up. I forced him to pull over, using the only leverage I had in that moment. And after what felt like an eternity, the car finally slowed and the doors unlocked. Sarah and I got out as fast as we could, not looking back until the van sped away. We stood there shaking, trying to process what had almost happened, until the real driver arrived a few minutes later. When we told him what happened, his expression changed. He said there had been reports of people posing as drivers in the area, targeting tourists who didn't know the city well, and that some people had gone missing. Hearing that made my stomach drop. We reported everything to the police, gave descriptions, answered questions, and then went back to the hotel, both of us silent for the rest of the night. We never heard anything back. No updates, no arrests, nothing. Even now, I still think about how easily it happened, how one simple assumption nearly put us in a situation we might not have escaped from. And I wonder how many other people got into that same car without realizing until it was too late. I was 26 when this happened. And even now, there are details that replay in my head at random moments, small things that didn't seem important at the time, but feel unsettling in hindsight. I was in Washington, D.C., visiting my fiancée, Sarah, who had just completed basic training and was about to graduate. We spent a long afternoon walking through the city, hours of monuments, crowds, and heat, and by early evening, we were completely drained. When Sarah ordered a ride back to the hotel, I barely looked up. That was my first mistake. We waited near the curb, and after about 10 minutes, a gray minivan slowed and stopped a short distance away. Not exactly where the app pin was, but close enough that it didn't raise alarms. Sarah walked up and asked, "Uber for Sarah?" The driver nodded once, slowly, without speaking. I remember thinking it was odd how he didn't even glance at his phone, but I brushed it off. We both got in, the door sliding shut with a heavy sound that felt louder than it should have. The inside of the van was strangely bare. No decorations, no water bottles, no music playing, just the low hum of the engine. The driver didn't greet us, didn't confirm our destination, didn't say a word. He pulled away immediately. After a few minutes, I noticed something else that felt wrong. He wasn't following traffic flow naturally. His turns were too smooth, almost rehearsed, and he avoided eye contact completely, even in the mirror. Then Sarah touched my arm, her hand shaking slightly, and tilted her phone toward me. The route on the screen didn't match where we were going. We were moving farther away from downtown, not closer to the hotel. Before I could say anything, her phone buzzed again. The notification said our ride had arrived. The real driver was asking where we were. In that moment, it felt like the air left my lungs. I looked at the driver more closely and realized the photo on the app didn't match him at all. My mind raced through every possibility, but none of them were good. I leaned forward and calmly told him we'd made a mistake and needed to get out. He didn't respond. He didn't even slow down. Instead, his grip on the steering wheel tightened, and I noticed his shoulders tense, like he was bracing himself. The silence stretched on, thick and oppressive, broken only by the sound of tires on pavement. I repeated myself, firmer this time, and finally he glanced at me through the rearview mirror. His eyes were cold, unreadable, and there was no surprise in them, no confusion, just awareness. That look told me this wasn't an accident. I forced him to pull over, using the only leverage I had in that moment. And after what felt like far too long, the van eased to the side of the road, and the locks clicked open. Sarah and I didn't hesitate. We jumped out and moved away from the vehicle as fast as we could. The van sped off immediately, disappearing around the corner without hesitation, like he knew exactly where he was going. When the real driver arrived a few minutes later, he looked genuinely shaken by our story. He told us, in a low voice, that there had been multiple reports of people impersonating drivers in the area, especially targeting tourists and couples, and that some of those cases were still unresolved. The word missing hung in the air between us. We reported everything to the police that night, gave descriptions, retraced our steps, but nothing ever came of it. No follow-up, no updates. What still haunts me isn't just how close we came to something far worse, but how easily it happened, how normal it all seemed, until it suddenly wasn't, and how many other people might have heard that same question. Uber for Sarah nodded and climbed into the back seat without ever realizing they were getting into the wrong car.